Where does the Gnostic element come into play in what you call your occult grammatology?
Yeah, so for me, like when I look at it from that point of view, so when Gnosticism, for instance, is kind of looked at from this grammatological point of view, or even the other way around in some way, because I try to bring all of these things together. Um, Occult grammatology, Gnosticism, and what I call like a participatory epistemology, this idea that one co-creates knowledge by way of participating, right? So I'm participating in the reading of the text, but I'm also allowing the text in some ways to read me, which is an interesting inversion. And that gets to the idea that many of the archetypal psychologists talk about, is that when there's an imaginal being or an imaginal figure, or there's this idea, there's a way in which you are being looked at from the perspective of the idea, right? You are being looked at from the perspective of the image. You're not just looking at and looking through the image. The image is also looking at and through you. And so that in many ways captures this idea of this participatory epistemological approach that I talk about. Um, but ultimately, for me, when I think about Gnosticism, it's the idea that Jung talked about. Like when Jung said, when Jung was asked that famous question, right, in his BBC interview, Dr. Jung, do you believe in God? Right? And do you remember what he says? He goes, no, I don't believe, I know. And so Gnosticism is this path through knowledge, knowing the divine experience. It's through experience, it's through knowing in a participatory, experiential way, not necessarily through faith, not necessarily through belief. And so when Jung talks about it, it's like, this is for me an experience. I've had the experience of the numinous. And therefore, when I talk about it, I talk about it from the point of view of knowing. But I go a step beyond that, because for me, it's also about unknowing, right? And it's also about non-knowledge. And it's also about the absence of the absolute when I'm talking about looking at these experiences through Bataille's work. And so when I think about knowing, I think about unknowing. When I think about knowledge, I think about non-knowledge. And so I'm always pairing things with its opposite so that in some way it keeps the space of desire open. So I never fully know something because I'm always pairing it with its opposite, which in some way, like when there's this idea, like just think about this notion of the adversary or oppositional power, the archetype of the adversary, and how you might apply that, right? It's not just saying no, like in negative theology, God is not this, God is not that, but God is the opposite of this and that, right? Andrew Chumley talks about that in some of his works. It's not just no, it's opposition. It's the opposite. God is the opposite of anything that you can imagine, right? He cites a Sufi mystic in suggesting that. And for me, like that gripped me tremendously. Like, wait a minute. So there's a way in which if I claim to know God, what I claim to know is the very opposite of what I claim to know. And therefore it escapes meaning. And so you enter into the void, you enter into the abyss, you enter into the realm of the black sun, right? That's for me the territory where all of this is found. And the signifiers for that are sometimes these Luciferian, satanic, Lilith-like images, right? That I don't literalize or mythologize, but I
Yeah.
see them also as sort of ontological constructs.
It's the adversary at play, right? Shaitan and so
Yes.
these are things that even in the traditions are seen as serving God and a part of God and in relationship to God, not oppositional. It's one of the I always appreciated that. I think it's just a GD thing, but in the GD we always have a teaching that not to mistreat or abuse unclean spirits, lower spirits, chthonic ones that you might need to be careful with. Still don't
Mhm.
mistreat them because they are too are holy and serve the one true Lord our God. But what stood out from what you're saying there is how that's even what your description is contained even in the idea of the monad and the point within the circle
Mm.
or Newton Hadith, right? The one is the other and the other is the one, but the two aren't the same and can't actually know each other, otherwise they cease to be what they are, right?
That's right.
But what the difference between a point and a circle or a sphere is essentially nothing. And that's the word of the day. The
That
watch.
is the word of the day. That's exactly right.
Um, how much does this see how I'm going to lead this into our next thing? How much does that of this plays a role in Howe and his anti-systematic approach to psychoanalysis? Wasn't
Yeah. So
wasn't
like
that, wasn't that a great segue?
that was a great segue. Yeah. So in many ways, this adversarial spirit, if we want to look at it from that point of view, infuses Howe's own approach, right? Because when even with his work in the Tavistock Clinic, right, there was this anti-systematic kind of approach that was being applied. He was very, in many ways, phenomenological, very humanistic in his approach, but still very much adhered to the tenets of depth psychology. But what was happening was that psychoanalysis was becoming a dogma, right, at the time, with its in-group, with its out-group, with its adherents, with its followers, and it was developing a school. And in many ways, Freud became this revered sort of figure, right? This totem figure, this father figure, right? And so what ended up happening with Howe was that it wasn't that he had a distaste for psychoanalysis, but the way in which it was being taken up. And so if you read his work, it's what psychoanalysis would look like if if the systematizing approach was taken away, if it wasn't a school of thought, if it wasn't a system of thought, if it was just ideas that were designed to help suffering souls and to bring them toward states of balance and wholeness, his is a psychoanalysis in some way that's stripped of any systematizing tendency. And so that adversarial oppositional spirit weaves through him, right? And so, like in the chapter on time and the unconscious, I talk about his dialogue with Jung, right? And so he challenges Jung. He takes Jung to
Oh yeah.
task. He says, look, your system is very four-dimensional. Like, because Howe was always talking about the three-dimensional versus the four-dimensional and beyond worlds, right? And he says, look, Dr. Jung, and I'm paraphrasing, right? Your system is four-dimensional, but you're describing it in a three-dimensional way. He takes him to task on that, challenges him.
It's tantamount to just, let's not read into it too far as calling Jung a fraud or anything like that, but he was definitely accusing him of perhaps, shall we say, cautioning, to use the old term applied to Edward Kelly and the like, and John Dee, even for any form of deception whatsoever, or mutation of truth and fact, right? Jung seemed to be afraid of the Freudians, if you ask me. Just Freud's reduction of spiritual experiences to
Yeah, to like pre-personal experience in many.
pre-personal. That's the word. Sorry, yeah.
Yep, yep, yeah.
So it's early
Wilbur
for me here,
wants
still on the West Coast.
No, that's perfectly fine. No, that's absolutely true. But what's interesting about Jung, so you have to read Jung's collected works differently now in the light of the Red Book, right? So in the light of the Red Book, in the light of the Seven Sermons to the Dead, which was published along with Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. But now that the Red Book has been published and now is widely consumed, you have to read all of the collected works differently. Because what you see in many ways, yeah, there was this fear in some ways of Freudians and orthodox psychoanalysis. But what he was trying to do was to explain the Red Book using analytic psychology. So if you look at all of the collected works, all of his scientific writings, all his Gnostic writings, all his alchemical works, all his works on psychotherapy, these are all ways of trying to explain what happened in the Red Book, right? Every single one. And so it's interesting that during that encounter that Howe had with him, there's a way in which Howe, without knowing it, was trying to solicit the Jung of the Red Book, just to say, look, I see in some way that this is a veneer, that this is a veil. Tell me what really is going on.
So he didn't know about the red book, but he sensed it
No,
was there. He sensed
no,
it.
for sure. He sensed that there was something there and that Jung wasn't being honest in his presentation, right? And so it was a very gentle, but at the same time, I think, powerful way of pointing in some way to that which was missing in Jung's discourse, which was soul, which was spirit, which was Philemon, the daimon, like all of this that really worked through Jung in the Red Book.
How much did Jung and Freud actually get rid of patients because they didn't fit their own theories?
So that's a good question. Who were they as clinicians, right? Who were they as therapists, right? So a lot of the stories about Freud, which are actually quite interesting, there's enough of them to show how many times Freud went outside of psychoanalytic theory to help or treat patients. There were many ways in which he was very compassionate, he was very humane, he was very caring, he was very unsystematic in some ways, right? And
So
so there
willing
were
to
some
burn canoes,
deviances. Hmm?
willing to burn the canoe sometimes.
Yes, exactly. And so there were deviances in that regard. And the way that Jung approached therapy, so I love the way Jung approached psychotherapy. And my sense is that he wouldn't get rid of patients if they didn't fit his particular theory. And the reason why is this, because Jung is what I think Jung was once known to have said, I'm glad I'm not a Jungian, right? And so
Oh, that's great.
Jung was
I never
very
heard that before.
anti-systematic in the way he actually approached doing clinical work. He presents his theory in this very systematic sort of way oftentimes, but it's more his followers that have systematized Jung more than anything else. And for Jung, each therapy was different because the person was different. He said there's no real Jungian psychotherapy because with each patient, there's a different therapy. And the way he describes psychotherapy, he said it's like when two chemicals come together. When two chemicals come together, they both leave different. They both leave changed. And so when I think about therapy or when I do supervision, that involves, in order for that to happen, you have to be a presence in the room in order to affect the client, but you also have to be open enough to be affected by them to do good therapeutic work. And so it's this encounter between two authentic individuals where transformation happens. So similar to what you and I are doing now, we don't have an agenda, we don't have a script. We're just meeting each other in this space, and we're seeing what happens as a result of this encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.